Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for today's discussion at the Nexus of Participation and Protection, Protection-Related Barriers to Women's Participation in Northern Ireland. My name is Phoebe Donnelly, and I'm a research fellow at the International Peace Institute and head of the Women, Peace and Security Program. Today's topic, importantly, covers the link between increasing women's participation and related protection concerns. And this is an area we will continue to explore at IPI in our Women, Peace and Security program. We'll have some future upcoming events related to this theme as well, so please do keep an eye out for invitations from us. For those of you who don't know IPI, or the International Peace Institute, we're an independent think tank focused on research and convening, headquartered in New York. Our Women, Peace and Security program has been around for about 3 years, and we have two main streams of work. The first is around realizing the promise of UN Security Council Resolution 1325. This includes work on women in peace operations and pressing and emerging questions related to women, peace, and security. Our second stream of work is around women's leadership and women's participation in peace processes. Before I turn the floor to Ms. Rachel Powell, I want to thank the outstanding Women, Peace and Security team, Gretchen Baldwin and Masuma Ramati, as well as the authors of this paper and all of the panelists at today's event. And finally, a special thank you to the government of Finland for funding the research and publication of the report we are discussing at today's event. With that, I will give the floor to Ms. Rachel Powell.
Thank you, Phoebe. So my name is Rachel Pyle. I'm the Women's Sector Lobbyist in Northern Ireland, and I work for the Women's Resource and Development Agency. So WRDA, we're absolutely delighted to be a part of this crucial research project. And we acted as a link between the researchers themselves and then women involved in peace building and leadership in Northern Ireland. So this was really to link the broader women's sector activists and also elected women in Northern Ireland with the researchers. For those that don't know WRDA, well, we are a membership organisation that has supported women, women's groups and networks across Northern Ireland since 1983. Our members are a key part of our work, and they keep us relevant and ensure that we are working on the issues that really matter to grassroots women. And one of the main priorities for women over the last number of decades has always been in maintaining peace, but also addressing the risks and barriers that women face in our society. We also act as an information hub for the women's sector while striving to raise the profile of women's issues in the wider media. We carry out a wide range of policy work and lobbying on behalf of women in Northern Ireland. And that's just another reason why we were really delighted to be a part of this research, which will very much support our efforts in this area. As a part of our vision to make women a visible force for change in Northern Ireland, we actively campaign on a number of issues. And this involves working with politicians, policymakers, and influencers to advocate for law and policy that promotes women's rights and equality, and for services that meet women's needs. We take a very participative, grassroots approach to this work, and in the women's sector, we very much try to embody all pillars of UN Security Council Resolution 1325 on women, peace, and security. We believe all women have the right to be involved in decision-making, and we aim to amplify the voices of women who engage with the women's sector. So we've worked on a wide range of peacebuilding initiatives from 1983 to present day, and I do know my colleague Elaine will probably touch on some of the work in the women's sector in the panel discussion. But some of this work has included measures on protection and prevention, but also a wide range of work at the moment on participation and recovery. 23 years on from the Good Friday Agreement, we've seen very limited action taken to address the risks that women face when involved in peace building, and women still face vast barriers in all forms of participation in our society. We still have inadequate legislation to deal with all forms of gender-based violence, a lack of positive measures on women's participation, a lack of a childcare strategy or government-funded provision, failure to implement a Northern Ireland Bill of Rights, and other shortfalls in relation to CEDAW recommendations, Istanbul Convention, tackling violence against women, and much, much more. So in this post-conflict society, we're also faced with a gender-neutral policymaking arena in Northern Ireland, where the efforts of the women's sector in calling for a gendered response to our protection and participation has still not come to effect. As we move beyond the ongoing pandemic, the disproportionate impact on women still hasn't been addressed, and without actively addressing women's safety and participation, we risk losing any progress towards gender equality in Northern Ireland. We have a strong history of working in peace building in the women's sector, including through developing toolkits, ongoing lobbying, engagement with grassroots women, and much more. We very much try to embody the pillars of 1325 in our work, and we know that this crucial research is addressing the link between pillars that is sometimes missing in our policy making. So we have been delighted to have been a part of this research, and I'd like to thank you for having me today and for having us along. I'd now like to hand you over to Gretchen Baldwin. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Rachel and Phoebe, so much for those introductory remarks. Hi, everyone. My name is Gretchen Baldwin, and I'm IPI's Senior Policy Analyst for Women, Peace, and Security. I just have one quick housekeeping note for those in the audience. Please note that you can submit questions for the panelists at any time using either the chat function or the Q&A box. So I do encourage you to do that throughout the panel discussion, and I'll be gathering your questions and we'll read them out during the Q&A portion of our event. And for those on the panel, I do just ask that you keep an eye on the time while speaking so we ensure that everyone has equal opportunity to share today. So I'm going to briefly introduce our distinguished panelists. First, we have our report authors, Dr. Catherine Turner and Dr. Ashlyn Swain. Excuse me, Ashlyn. Dr. Catherine Turner is Associate Professor of International Law at Durham University in the United Kingdom. She is the Deputy Director of the Durham Global Security Institute, where her areas of research and teaching expertise include international law, peace mediation, transitional justice, and women in mediation. In addition to her academic work, Catherine has extensive experience as a practitioner and trainer in mediation and good relations in Northern Ireland. Dr. Ashlyn Swain is Professor of Gender Studies in the School of Social Policy, Social Work, and Social Justice, University College Dublin. She was named by Apolitical as one of the world's 100 most influential people in gender policy in 2021. Prior to her entering academia roles, Ashlyn worked with UN agencies and international NGOs in humanitarian and peace-building settings globally. We're honored to have 3 additional panelists with us today to be in conversation with the authors. First, Sarah Douglas is the Deputy Chief of the Peace and Security Section in UN Women's New York headquarters. Prior to this appointment, she served as the gender advisor at the UN Peacebuilding Support Office and as a policy specialist in the Peace and Security team. Sarah has led in UN Women's work on integrating gender and women's issues into security sector reform, disarmament, demobilization and reintegration, community security and arms control, and other stability processes. Dr. Sarah Taylor is currently a policy specialist at UN Women working on the Women, Peace and Security Humanitarian Action Compact, and is on leave from her usual role as a director at Inclusive Peace to take up this role. She has worked in this field on research, policy, and practice for close to 20 years, including with the NGO Working Group on WPS, IPI, and a note that Sarah actually founded our WPS program here at IPI, as well as Human Rights Watch. Sarah's expertise spans a broad range of topics, including women's rights in conflict, WPS in the UN Security Council, WPS considerations in specific conflict situations, gender and UN peace operations, and the linkages between women's rights and peace. And Elaine Crory has been Good Relations Coordinator at the Women's Resource and Development Agency since 2018. In this role, she designs and delivers projects intended to involve women in Northern Ireland with the Women, Peace and Security agenda. She also works on the Raise Your Voice project, which tackles sexual harassment and violence in Northern Ireland. She has also worked in community education for a number of years, teaching history and politics to adult learners, and as an activist with a number of feminist grassroots organizations. Thank you all so much for being here. I will now turn to Catherine to begin the presentation of the research.
Thank you very much, Gretchen, and thank you very much to the IPI for the invitation to conduct this research in the first place. It really has been a very engaging piece of research to conduct, and I hope that the findings will be useful in terms of the broader conversations. Northern Ireland is often thought of as a historic case when it comes to women, peace and security. You know, the story of the Northern Ireland Women's Coalition is well known, their participation in the talks and the equality provisions that were secured in the agreement. But looking at it now, 20 years later, gives new perspective, not only on the connections between participation and influence, but also on what participation entails for women. And so when we first discussed this research, I had an idea that there would be something interesting to say about how politics has evolved in Northern Ireland since the agreement. But it was only really when we started talking to the women themselves that we saw just how clearly these two pillars of participation and protection are interacting with each other. And certainly looking at the two pillars together and working together with Ashlyn as well has generated significant insight into each of them individually that I think mightn't have arisen if we had just looked at them separately. So here I'll focus on the participation aspects of the findings, and I'll let Ashlyn comment on protection. So for me, the findings speak to, and in some sense challenge, three core aspects of participation under the Women, Peace and Security agenda. The first is the way that we conceptualise participation and the relationship between participation and gender-sensitive outcomes. Policy on women's participation and the ways in which it's supported tends to coalesce around this nexus between representation and substantive outcomes. And yet the inclusion of a provision on women's full and equal participation in public life in the Belfast Agreement hasn't resulted, as Rachel has been explaining, in a strong commitment to gender-sensitive law or policy. The numbers of women who are participating in politics and in the justice and security sectors, particularly at the senior level, remain low. And recent events have shown us that having women in leadership roles, and most notably that of the First Minister and the Deputy First Minister, hasn't been enough to challenge deep-rooted attitudes towards women. So during the research, we heard time and time again how policy making was made on a strictly gender-neutral basis, and how many pieces of progressive legislation to address equality had not been progressed because of the state of crisis that pervades politics. And so it seems that the equality provisions in the agreement have had little impact when it comes to women's participation, and indeed to gender-sensitive policy making. And this highlights the need to look at participation as a long-term endeavour that extends well beyond the negotiation and the signing of a peace agreement into embedding mechanisms for participation into the implementation phase and beyond. So it was also important for us to look at participation in its broadest sense. So we wanted to create a framework for capturing the extent of women's participation across the whole spectrum of the Women, Peace and Security resolutions, including peace builders and human rights defenders, but also politicians and women in the reformed justice and security sectors. And so this added some nuance to the perceived link between participation and gender sensitivity. In the research, some women identified as feminist, some did not, and some resisted the idea that they should be considered as feminist or as having a responsibility for advancing gender policy more broadly. And there was a clearly identifiable tension for women between speaking out about sexist attitudes and inequalities and being accused of playing the woman card and undermining their own credibility as a result. And yet, despite their different motivations for their work and their different attitudes towards gender and feminism, we find clearly complementary understandings and experiences across these diverse groups of women, which has helped us to arrive at a more in-depth picture of the common challenges that united women in Northern Ireland. So the second theme then, in relation to research on women mediators and peace builders, has been that women can often access mediation roles because they're seen as less threatening and as less political than men. And in many countries, or in some countries anyway, including Northern Ireland, cultural taboos will often, but not always, mitigate the risk of direct physical violence against women peace builders. But the research found clearly that while women did play these intermediary roles with armed groups, they themselves felt that they existed in a grey zone of risk, whereby they were engaged in work that fell outside the scope of legal and policy protection, even while the policies were encouraging them to act in these roles. Some of them had been attacked, many of them had been threatened as a result of their work. And interestingly, the level of threat rose depending on the extent to which women were challenging existing power holders within this community. So I think this really does confirm the need for research into the experience of women, peace builders particularly, and how they experience risk. And finally then, I suppose the main finding for me from a participation perspective was this circularity between the low numbers of women who are participating in public and political life, their exposure to risks and threats, And then the impact that this has on women's participation generally and creating a disincentive. And so while it's often expected that women's participation in political and public life, and including in the security sector, will make these spaces safe for women, the research clearly showed that when women participated in small numbers, they lacked the influence to make meaningful change on systemic barriers. And instead, they faced threats and abuse that were designed to silence them and to discourage women from participating. And so we can highlight and celebrate the successes of individual women leaders and the contribution that they make to peace and security. But ultimately, we also need to look at the structural barriers that prevent women from participating in greater numbers. And from this research, I think protection clearly emerges as one of those. So I'll hand over to Ashlyn to a bit more.
Great, thanks, Katrin. Hello, everybody, and thank you for being here. Thanks to IPI for hosting the event and WRDA for all their help during the research, and my co-author Katrin for the fun and the enjoyment of doing this research together on these issues. It really has been quite an illuminating experience, and what I'm going to do, as Katrin said, is just really speak a little bit about the protection concerns that arose from the research that I think should divert our attention specifically towards how we understand protection under the Women, Peace and Security agenda. I think one of the most stark things that popped out of the research for me, and that is really, I think, clear when you read the report, is the extent to which women are experiencing levels of threat, risk and harassment as part of their participation in public life and as part of just going about their everyday as professionals in their chosen areas of work. And also how normalized that is, actually, how accepted it is that this is part of the everyday of what it means to be a leader in public life in Northern Ireland. And as Katrin said, we spoke to women from across the political divides and also from kind of community sector work into the reformed justice and security institutions and public sector institutions, as well as then in elected politics. And what I'm going to do is offer just a flavour of some of the protection risks that arose, the stories and experiences that women shared with us, just to highlight some of those to give context to our discussion here today. And then a couple of key messages that I think come out of that for us to think about as people who work on women, peace and security and on the implementation of that agenda in conflict and post-conflict contexts. The first thing as regards the levels of protection risks and challenges that arise is we found that those threats and risks, which I will talk about specifically in a moment, actually emerge out of and on the basis of a bedrock of gendered inequalities and sexism and misogyny that exists in Northern Ireland society, and you know, we could argue every society around the world. But it's important to acknowledge that that kind of depth of sexism and harassment that women experience for being, I suppose, bold enough to speak out in public and to be in positions of leadership and to challenge gender norms and stereotypes is part of the basis of where women's experiences of threats and risk come from. We've seen, for example, recently the more recent First Minister and Deputy First Minister female speak out publicly about the extent to which they were in receipt of derogatory comments and sexist remarks on their dress. And the women we spoke to talked about the way that they would get snide comments and innuendos when they're speaking in public forums. They would get sexist criticisms of the contributions they were making to public life and undermining of that work on a very distinctive sexist basis. And all of that basis of the everyday sexism, if you like, that women experience intermingles then with the legacy of the political contestation that Northern Ireland has experienced. And that intermingles with sectarianism, the fallout of the conflict and the contract of the peace agreement, which I'll talk about in a couple of moments. But what we identified was then 4 different categories of risks and threats that are the intersection of the sexism and gender inequalities that women will experience anywhere and everywhere with the outcome and the fallout of the legacy of the conflict. So the first of those were direct threats and threats to physical threats, if you like, to women's lives and their safety, if you like. These include verbalized threats, whether by phone or communicated secondhand through interlocutors. Often direct threats would be communicated to women through the police, where threats would be phoned into the police and then communicated to women through the policing services, receiving knocks on the door in the middle of the night, for example, to let them know that they've had a direct threat to their lives. And a security assessment would be made by the police, and the police have a specific means of dealing with these kinds of threats. Other ways are, for example, women in policing and in other sectors who would have to check under their car every morning for incendiary devices, which unfortunately is a common practice and well known in Northern Ireland throughout the Troubles and since the Troubles. And that many respondents felt that there was this backdrop of a direct physical threat all the time and persistent in their everyday as they went about their work. It's important to note that some of those physical threats are shared with men, and those who take on particular roles that would, I suppose, challenge the prevailing status quo around sectarianism, such as policing or security. But also for women, I think they expressed a sense of the idea that there would be a threat of a sexualized element to some of those threats that were coming in, different levels and depth to the way the threats were delivered in terms of the sexism behind the threats. And also when those threats, such as finding of devices under cars, were delivered in the media, there was also this gender trope around how more impactful or shameful it was that women would receive these rather than men, speaking to this, again, sexism around whether women should or could be in these leadership roles in society in Northern Ireland. The second area were threats to women's homes and families. Women felt that because our Northern Ireland is a small place, and whether you're in a public role such as an elected official or otherwise, your home was known and where you lived was known, your address might be known. And if it wasn't, then some of those with the intention to deliver threats would, for example, post graffiti of the address of your home on the gable end of houses to let it be known where you live, to enable attacks on your home, if you like. And attacks would include things like firing of missiles through your windows, some women saying that they keep an eye on the windows all the time or stay away from the windows in their homes at times whenever they felt there was a level of threat on them. And these acts all obviously serve to intimidate and stymie women's participation and shush them in terms of any of the public speaking they may have been making, or their representation, or the challenge that they represent in terms of challenging sectarianism and division and ongoing need for reconciliation in their communities. A third area is direct threats to their workplaces. So certainly women were targeted because of the work that they do. And all of the women we spoke to spoke about how their work is focused on cross-community conciliatory work that we feel and can see is a direct challenge to the sectarian power holes that came out of the peace agreement for some of the non-state armed groups in the kind of aftermath of the conflict. Women's community centres, their workplaces were targeted. Women were intimidated at their workplaces. There were attempts to control the way that they worked at community level and otherwise by such groups. And women were living with that in the everyday, and it certainly affected the way that they were able to go about their work. And then lastly, there was an element of public shaming that was taking place through public media, the everyday mainstream media, if you like, through social media, and also in public places by, again, posting sexualized images of women, taunting and targeting of women and their sexualities and their reproductive capacities and choices, derogatory comments on their bodies. And you really, I think, a pronounced sense of the way that social media is now used as a specific platform to troll and take down and undermine and public shame women's professional lives and their professional profiles. And women expressed really that how hard that was and how tough that was, that constant harassment coming into your device in your hand and in your home and having to deal with that. So there's quite a volume to public and private spaces threats that women are experiencing, all of it targeted to directly intimidate and stymie the way that women are effective in their work, if you like, from community up to political levels. And three key points I'm going to make out of that we observed. One is that it's really important to acknowledge the way that sectarianism, the violent masculinities coming out of the conflict and community polarization directly coming from the Troubles influences women's participation. What we often hear and see in international policy forums is the idea that gender issues and women's rights and women's participation, that comes later. We're dealing with the politics of the conflict now. Whereas actually this research shows that there's a direct connection between the fallout of the politics of a conflict and women's rights concerns and interests and women's ability to participate. Women's peace and security agenda is a political issue, and it becomes hyper-political in these kinds of contexts where women's participation represents a direct confrontation, if you like, to the political share of power, if you like, that has come out of the peace agreement. And that relates to the second point that we think about protection, is that in Northern Ireland, like many contexts, there have been multiple iterations of renegotiation of the peace agreement, ongoing attempts to implement the peace agreement, and actually the way that women engage and and the work that women do around trying to break down sectarianism and division at community level, that all actually confronts head on the informal power contract and power sharing contract that has come out of the peace agreement. And that needs to be acknowledged, really, and that where, as Catherine said, we're expecting women to take this role in mediating between these interlocutors, actually you're really asking women to confront these really hard political issues and not actually understanding the risks that they may experience because of that. And then just lastly, is to understand this concept of protection that we talk about under the Women, Peace and Security agenda. We know over the last 20 years that protection has become largely tied to the issue of conflict-related sexual violence in conflict. We know that there has been attempts to broaden out the language around broader gender-based violence, but there really is, I think, this research shows a need to understand protection more broadly and the interlinkage between these pillars of participation and protection. And that within protection, there's not just forms of harm and broader harm of where those happen and why those happen that we need to pay attention to, but also this subjective sense of threat. Women know when threats are being delivered to them on a sexist or otherwise basis, and that those subtle threats and those understandings that women have of how violence plays out in the conflict, how threats actually happen in a conflict setting and afterwards, and how that intermingles with sexism, that knowledge that they hold and that they carry, that's not forming part of how we understand participation and or protection in the Women, Peace and Security agenda. And we do really need to get to grips with the subjectivity of experience of threats and how we deal with them. We know that if women are not safe, they can't participate fully and equally. And it really is, I think, telling from the research of how interlinked these two ideas are. I leave it there. Thanks, Gretchen.
Thank you so much, Catherine and Aisling. It's been an honor to get to work on this report with both of you. And I would encourage everyone watching this, if you have not yet, do check out the report. I know our events team has put a link in the chat, and I believe it's on social media as well. But it is absolutely phenomenal research. So thank you so much for summarizing here. Next, I'll pass over to Sarah Douglas for her remarks. Sarah?
Thank you, Gretchen, and thank you so much to the speakers who have gone already. I think this is such an interesting and important contribution to our knowledge because of the kind of longitudinal perspective that it's taking over the years. So I wanted to mention a couple of our statistics from this past year's Secretary General's report to the Security Council on Women, Peace and Security, that despite 20 years of activism and advocacy on the part of civil society and member states and activists, we reported last year that still only 13% of negotiators, 6% of mediators, and 6% of signatories to all peace processes between 1992 and 2019 were women. And I think what this also tells us, given when we look at the state of the world, is that exclusive peace processes don't hold. Inclusive peace processes do. And I think that's what the example of Northern Ireland shows us. But I think what's so interesting about what our colleagues have presented this morning is that once the peace agreement has been signed, the work for gender equality advocates is certainly not over. And that's what the member states gave us in the sustaining peace resolutions, was the understanding that conflict is not linear and that conflict prevention and building peace carries on many decades post the signing of a peace agreement. And I think the unfinished business of the peace process that the colleagues have been describing so far really gets to the heart of that concept. And also perhaps another element that should be looked at is the importance of the justice mechanisms and how central those could be to getting to that, the root causes of conflicts that have not been addressed as described by Catherine and Aisling. So the second main point I wanted to raise was just to mention about the Women, Peace and Security and Humanitarian Action Compact, which is being launched next week at the Generation Equality Forum, because many of the challenges and issues that have been raised by the participants have been incorporated into this platform for action. And I don't want to go into too much detail because many of you have heard about this, but I think it's an important opportunity today to pitch to the stakeholders who are on the call, member states, civil society, UN entities, and academia about the importance of taking action on these commitments so that we can really galvanize the momentum on women, peace, and security. So specifically on some of the priorities that have been mentioned in terms of turning participation into influence, securing participation, and then turning that into influence, the compact raises a few specific actions, things like incentives and pressure on the parties to make sure that women are at the table. One of the challenges that we have within the UN system is that obviously these processes are owned by the parties. And although that's not necessarily fair, it is what it is. And so we really need member states and civil society to be advocating and putting on pressure parties to make sure that women are there. Also, funding of local women's organizations to ensure that they are able to participate in peace processes and overcome the many operational and logistical barriers that they face to doing so. And then the last one I want to highlight is the importance, which gets to what we're discussing today, of financing research to be able to close the data and understanding gaps. And I think what's so interesting about the case study that's been presented today is that it's really looking at the decades after and how women's organizing and feminist approaches are so necessary to understand the root causes of the continued instability and the unfinished business of the peace process, and also struggles for gender equality at the same time. So in closing, I encourage all of the organizations who are participating today to become signatories to the compact and to continue to mobilize your constituents and your partners to take this journey with us as UN Women and all of the stakeholders involved, and make sure that when we're celebrating the 25th and the 30th anniversary of 1325, we have very tangible progress to reflect on. So I'll leave it there, but thank you so much to the participants and especially to the researchers for this fascinating discussion.
Thank you so much, Sarah. And thank you for highlighting the timing with the new compact is phenomenal. I'm so pleased about that. So thank you so much for sharing with us. Next, we'll turn to our second Sarah, Sarah Taylor.
Thank you so much, everybody. I really just am so, I could not recommend enough that everyone read this paper. I am so delighted to be here with all of you this morning, this afternoon, this evening, wherever everyone is in the world. So yeah, I really will re-up Gretchen's push and everybody's push to read the paper, because it's really both incredibly concrete and specific, but also so applicable to so many situations that we're grappling with globally at the moment. I'll be using a woman, peace, and security lens for my comments today, which will come as a shock to absolutely no one who knows me. So I just want to reiterate a couple of things that have already been raised before I raise a couple of additional points. One is, you know, as we said in my bio, I've been working on the compact, and Sarah Douglas has so clearly laid out the way that that the compact brings together these issues in a holistic way. But I remain so surprised, I guess, and frustrated at the continuing pillaring and segregation of these issues. One of the things about the Women, Peace, and Security agenda is that it strives to recognize the intersections of all of these issues, right? Participation is inextricably linked with protection. Protection is inextricably linked with participation. So, you know, I think what we see at the moment in terms of the international policy and framing is that we are sort of at a point where we're experiencing this separation as policymakers, and to a certain degree programming has endeavored to concretize the particular aspects of the Women, Peace, and Security agenda, but in doing so, it's sort of artificially separated these issues out, and we're seeing the ramifications of that. So the other thing that I really want to re-up, and I actually had a little highlighted point in my comments this morning, is this issue that Ashlyn reiterated at the end of her comments, which is that women's rights, gender equality, women's participation is at the center of political crisis and conflict. not something that is an addendum to. If we are not grappling with these issues, we are not grappling with the project of peace building, right? So as the quote that I had highlighted is, this is particularly relevant for women involved in political or community development work who advocate partisan political positions rather than conciliatory approaches as well, right? We have to recognize that women in all of our diversity, multiple political perspectives, multiple ways of engaging are part of this effort to build peace. And when we're talking about participation and protection, we are talking about that diversity. So we are clearly still in need of better policy, better programming to properly address this interlinkage between participation and protection. As the authors well note, this is not solved with an additive approach, nor is it necessarily solved with a securitized approach. So I think one of the things we need to do is we need to move away from a narrowly defined approach of who counts in peace efforts writ large, right? So I'm speaking here from this sort of like international policy framework perspective. It is certainly about women who are track one negotiators or involved in track one negotiations, these formal elite processes, but it is about women who are engaging in all aspects of leadership and public life in the context of peace efforts. So I'll come back to what that context of peace efforts looks like as well. So I just want to raise two examples. One is in Afghanistan, for example, women journalists, peace activists, community leaders have been particularly targeted over the last year as the talks between the government and the Taliban have stalled, leading to deaths of many and the evacuation of others from the country. And indeed, as UN Women has noted, 2020 marks the highest number of women killed since UNAMA began systematic documentation. That is despite all of the efforts from the international community to raise the important issues around women's participation and protection. So clearly it is not just a matter of highlighting that these issues are occurring. And then the other, which is I think slightly less well known, is this issue around women engaging in multilateral fora. So one of the real challenges in the UN Security Council at the moment is women's civil society leaders have been targeted and have experienced reprisals for raising issues and speaking and briefing the Security Council, right? So that I think we need to do some better documentation on that, but it also does show that merely by being, you don't gain the protection that you need by having a public spotlight. You know, you don't sort of gain that protection of people know that you've been there, people will be aware that you're not, that makes you a harder target somehow. So just clarifying that this is an international issue and the international policy is not addressing it sufficiently. I just want to point to a couple of things. One is this point that's been brought up regularly throughout this conversation, and Tanya Poffenholtz from Inclusive Peace talks about the issue of perpetual peace building. I think that this is absolutely crucial to the way that we understand, for example, I'm getting a time warning. This is absolutely crucial to understanding, for example, the context that the report addresses, but also looking at Somalia, looking at Yemen. You know, these are not protection considerations and participation considerations that end with an agreement or with a track one process. These are decade-long efforts, and they required a decades-long approach, this iterative process of building peace, of building a perpetual peace, and of community resilience. So finally, I think it would be unsurprising that I make a plea for more research on this topic, for more analysis on this topic. I really think that one of the things that this project crucially highlights is the need to be recording the experiences and insights of women leaders in conflict-affected contexts, right? We need to be, I don't want to say telling the stories because these aren't stories. These are experiences, these are lived experiences, and these women have insights into what needs to happen to allow them to fully participate in all their diversity. And of course, policy and programming needs to be guided by those insights. So that final point, I guess, is really listen to women when they tell you that they are experiencing these threats. Take them seriously and understand that these experiences are at the heart of real long-term lasting peace building efforts. So I'll leave it there, and thanks so much again to everybody for this great conversation.
Thank you so much, Sarah. Phenomenal. So finally, we'll turn to Elaine Crory for her opening remarks.
Hello, everybody, and thank you so much to the IPI for having me, and thank you particularly to Catherine and Ashlyn for writing this report. I read it late in the afternoon as I was about to log off for the day and made so many notes that I thought, you know, I need to come back and read this again fresh tomorrow. I've read it a few times now, and what was most striking to me was just how much it rang true to me in terms of what the women that I'm working with are telling me when I'm working with them. So as was mentioned in my introduction, I'm doing this peace building work, cross community work with women in Northern Ireland. We're talking about difficult topics like flags, like interfaces, like emblems and all of that, and what community means to them. And they're telling me exactly what's in this report. Plus, what really jumped out to me about that sort of circle of low participation, amplifying the visibility of these women, that leading to protection risks, and those protection risks further leading to a very low incentive to participate, making those women even more visible and round in circles, is above all of that like a sort of a storm cloud that seems to dominate women's lives, is this sense that this is how it's going to be, because this is how the situation has been scripted. And I do mean scripted, you know, not literally, but the way these women perceive it is as if this situation is a play. The play has been written by a playwright who has given lines to certain characters. And those women have been given a walk-on part. If they're lucky, you know, they get a walk-on part, they might just be part of a chorus. The main thrust of it is focused on the main characters, and those are not these women. Inherently, it's never going to be them. And that is visible in things like the fact that women's issues, in inverted commas, are seen as a bolt-on, you know, a kind of an add-on, the last minute addition to an agenda, the thing that we have to have there, there has to be a visible woman of some sort so that we can say that we included women, but we're not really going to focus on these issues. We're certainly not going to name them for what they are. We're not going to talk openly about misogyny and the sexism that lies behind so much of this. We're just going to let it hang in the air. And there she raised it, you know, there this walk-on part raised it, you know, it's easily dismissed. It's only a walk-on part. And this is very visible in the fact that our policies here are not gendered in a gender sensitive way. They are gender neutral in a way that makes it so hard to even raise the issues. And this is especially visible in asking women to lead the way in anti-paramilitary work in communities. So this goes back to the part about participation, and there's so many issues about this particular approach that sort of summarize the issues we're talking about here. First of all, there's dangers and there's limitations in terms of what that work can actually achieve. And these women who are being asked to do the work, or who are being asked to recognize this work as being the most valuable work that there is, they are finding this this whole approach to be part of that script that limits what they can do. First of all, it limits them in terms of their power to speak. They know that they're subject maybe to, they're in receipt of maybe certain information that would endanger them if they spoke out. So it's a guarantee that they won't speak out. It endangers them in a very practical way. It opens them up to threats because they are so visible. And the knowledge that if anybody speaks out about it, we know it was you, is just sort of unspoken, I suppose, background to that. It also encourages the view that anybody who enters that work does so knowing the risks they're taking on. So that then if she complains about it later, well, why did she enter that line of work in the first place? You know, she put herself in that position. Was that wise? Is it in some way her fault? That victim blaming narrative that's there throughout so much of women's lives is also there in this particular line of work. And also it encourages that view that if she does complain about particular kinds of threats that she receives, it's because women aren't cut out for this work in the first place. So it's not only undermining her in that moment, it's undermining women more broadly beyond that. And all of this serves to undermine all the achievements of peace building work women have been doing over decades in this place. Nowadays that sort of cross community work that has built, I suppose, really stable and really respectful relationships across communities that women were doing since the 1970s and 80s, that is being undermined by the continual cutting of funding, while work has been funneled into the kind of work that is supposed to be targeted at empowering these women to tackle paramilitaries in their own communities. That type of work is not producing the kind of results that we need to see. And the kind of work that was producing results is being undermined and underfunded. So it's a very circular relationship, like the report outlines, but it's got even more going into that than that we need to zoom out, I suppose, and see the broader context and how this will self-perpetuate forever unless an intervention is made. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Elaine. That was fantastic. Thank you all of our panelists for your remarks. So before we turn to our next round of questions, I'd like to introduce the first Secretary for Human Rights and Gender Equality with the permanent mission of Ireland to the United Nations to make a brief intervention. And I do hope that I'm pronouncing your name correctly, Cuiva Nihonhor.
That was amazing, Gretchen. Thank you. And I really just want to congratulate Ashlyn and Catherine on an absolutely superb piece of scholarship. I mean, it is as close to a page turner as I have read in several months, years on WPS. It's really such an important document, and I've really been delighted to be able to participate today and to learn from the panelists. And Elaine, also, I mean, that's your metaphor about women being confined to walk-on parts in a script they didn't write. I mean, with your permission, I would love to steal that line for a statement because it's really spot on. I mean, just a couple of points on my side from my reading of the paper. I just want to again congratulate the authors for the centering of women's voices that comes out so strongly in the paper. I mean, really, this could not be more timely, and timely is a word that is overused, but genuinely, it could not be more timely. I mean, it's a piece of work that's extremely important in the Northern Ireland context, but genuinely has universal applicability. And I say that, you know, in the trenches here in the Security Council work on WPS, I mean, this is something that's coming up right across the board, that very circular and porous relationship between participation and protection. Colleagues on the call probably are aware that Ireland is co-chairing with Mexico the Informal Experts Group on WPS. And I mean, in recent discussions on Yemen, on Libya, and a discussion we'll have next week on Somalia, this is right on the money, that connection between participation and protection, the fact that this is underexplored. And just recently, we actually managed to successfully insert language making that link in a resolution in a Security Council resolution on Libya. And then, I mean, coming back to Northern Ireland specifically, I mean, it's just so important to acknowledge the long shadow that the gendered impact of conflict has cast. I mean, the WPS narrative around Northern Ireland has tended to focus very much on the successful participation of the Northern Ireland Women's Coalition. And I just think it's really good that we maintain that nuance and that recognition that this has been a work of decades by politically active women and women in public life. And that the work of ensuring their participation is the work of decades. I thought there were a couple of other really important things that came out in the paper. The link, the tension between sectarianism, paramilitarism, DDR, and women's community activism, including, in fact, competition for resources. I thought that was a really important point that the paper drew out. Another thing that I found very useful was the rejection of the dyad of human rights defenders and peace builders as the only way for women to be politically active. Incredibly helpful, and again, universal applicability, I think. And then also that heightened visibility issue, just by the sheer fact of the participation of women
in small numbers raises the risk. And again, we see that right across the WPS context we're working in. And also drawing out the toxicity of the online abuse. So I feel I've spoken for long enough, all that to say, just thank you for this great tool that you've given us for all of us working on WPS issues, and also for policymakers in Northern Ireland. I think this is a really, really important piece of scholarship, and I can only congratulate you and thank you, and look forward to taking it forward. Thank you.
Eva, thank you so much for your statement and your support. I'm especially pleased to hear you bring up that rejection of the dyad between women human rights defenders and peace builders, because I have a lot of questions for the authors on that particular point. So first of all, I'd like to remind our audience, wherever you're watching, if you're on the Zoom webinar, you can submit questions via the Q&A function or the chat. Likewise, if you're watching via social media, you can comment, tweet at us if you have questions, and our events team will be gathering questions for me to then pose to the panelists. But first, I have a couple of questions that I'd like to pose. So the first is specifically for Ashlyn, but as we've discussed, any panelists are welcome to raise their hand and put a two-finger on. So Ashlyn, I'd love to hear a bit more on what work is currently happening in Northern Ireland to address the concerns and protection risks outlined both by your interviewees and then you and Catherine in your report more broadly. How are the gaps highlighted by this research being addressed in the country right now?
Yeah, I think that actually might hand that over to Elaine in terms of what's happening in Northern Ireland right now.
Great.
Yeah. Sorry, is that all right? Yeah.
Sorry about that. That's great. Elaine, does that sound fine?
Yes, so this is a difficult one because on a broader level, it is hard to give a positive answer because on the ground, an awful lot of community work that I spoke of as being good work, I suppose I do have a bias here, but also an awful lot of the grass level work specifically focused on women and on getting women involved in this kind of work is being underfunded or has lost its funding entirely. Also, there's a concern among the women who were the generation of, I suppose, peace builders in the 1970s and 80s. They're reaching retirement age, and some are actually postponing their retirement so that they can continue to do this work for as long as possible. But there isn't really a legacy process in place. They're going to eventually retire, and there hasn't really been funding for them to, I suppose, share the learning with a younger generation of women peace builders. And there are a relatively low number of women willing to step into that role for all of the reasons that this report is very clear on. On a sort of a broader level, on a policy level, there is the same roadblocks that we discussed earlier. We're not really looking at things from a gender perspective or gender sensitive perspective. There is work being done. In fact, we've produced a feminist recovery plan last year. I say we, WRDA is one of the organisations among many involved in the Women's Policy Group that has worked on a feminist recovery plan, and we were relaunching it again this summer, sort of updated and rejigged, which does have recommendations in it on how to go about this peace building in a better way. I'm biased in this because I wrote that section, so I can't be completely honest in saying it's the best thing ever, but it does have a sort of a quite radical approach, I suppose, to what we could do if we're genuinely looking to demobilise paramilitaries and genuinely looking to build a sustaining peace. And some of this involves, you know, paramilitaries. How do we really understand what that word means nowadays? It certainly doesn't mean what it used to mean in the 70s and 80s. Nowadays, it's much more associated with, for want of a better way of putting it, common criminality. And the main area in which they're involved is things like drugs. So how could we better conceive of that? How could we take that area of work, for want of a nicer way of putting it, and put it into the hands of somebody that is better? such as decriminalizing it and putting it within a medical context. It would help, of course, with issues to do with mental health and addiction services and seeing them as health problems and so on. But also it would directly hobble, in some ways, the paramilitaries and the control they have over their communities. We also have suggestions regarding a robust, I'm using that word with several lines under it, a robust reappraisal of how the funding process works in Northern Ireland, so that the funding is going where it's effective. And that would obviously involve some sort of qualitative analysis of the peace building work that has been done, which there's a general lack of. I mean, any sort of qualitative analysis is lacking. To see what is working, what's actually having an effect on the ground, what's keeping people away from riots, what's keeping people away from the whole circle of toxicity that surrounds this issue, and what's directing people in another way, and then funding that instead of funding things that might actually perpetuate the circle. So those are our recommendations. Now, of course, the dark side of that is who's listening to them? Are they being taken seriously? Are they being taken on board? I wish I could say yes. But unfortunately, a lot of these things, you know, they sit on paper, and the people who could make the decisions aren't making them.
Thank you so much, Elaine. Yeah, I feel like that's the constant struggle with any policy recommendations, is who is listening and how do we actually go beyond even just getting the recommendations in policymakers' hands, but actually ensure that implementation is happening. Thank you so much for expanding on that. So I have an additional question that I'd love to pose to all of our panelists. Sarah Taylor touched on this particularly in her opening remarks. So Sarah, maybe you'd like to start, but no pressure, and I'd love to hear from anyone who would like to speak to this. Getting back again to the implementation question, how can advocates for the WPS agenda push for its implementation in a way that takes into account the myriad participation concerns of politically diverse women, both within and outside of formal institutional structures? So this is a big theme in the paper. And again, Sarah, I believe you quite explicitly spoke to this in your opening remarks, but I'd love to hear some concrete ways that we can push for implementation of a broader inclusion.
Sure. Yeah, I'll just make a couple of points on this, and then I'm sure there'll be many other points from the colleagues to bring in. I think one of the things that we need to do is we need to potentially reframe that approach, right? Advocates and women peace builders have been talking about this need for protection for decades, right? I mean, you know, there are these sort of, I remember women peace builders and lead negotiators coming to New York to participate in ARIA formula meetings, talking about wearing 2 pairs of pants when they would go to negotiations, because that made it harder for anyone who was intending to sexually assault them as they were going to try to participate. I mean, you know, this is not an issue that is new to advocates. I think the onus is really on all of us who are involved in the work of facilitating, supporting, and providing sort of design input into what is an actual inclusive approach to efforts to build peace. And so this means not only focusing on track 1, it means focusing on track 2 and track 3, listening to women about what processes need to be incorporating and including, and that policymakers take on the responsibility for listening. And so I think it's just a slightly different question than putting the onus on the women peace builders or, you know, women who have been activists who have been raising this. It's really about putting the onus on policymakers themselves as well. I'll refrain from making another pitch for the compact, but that is an option.
I think it's a great and important pitch. So thank you for alluding to it. Would any other panelists like to speak to that particular question? Sarah, yes, please. Other Sarah. Sorry.
Thank you. You can never have too many Sarahs. Thanks so much, colleagues, for this fascinating discussion. I wanted to raise the example just as another case of the experience of UN Women supporting the Syrian Women's Advisory Board. And this is a very complex and fraught example, so I'm kind of oversimplifying, but I just wanted to use it as an example to speak to the issue of constituency building and how to promote kind of a common message from a very diverse group of women who are often and understandably at odds or even in conflict with each other. So our example from the Syrian Women's Advisory Board was that we actually started out with a very, very small group of people, of women, who are mostly in the diaspora, and started out, and at the time it was, this was many years ago now, and every international actor was trying to work with Syrian women, and it was very complicated and a lot of politics and a lot of rivalries between the different different entities who wanted to support different groups of women. So we started out with a very small group of women, mostly working in Arabic through our regional office, which ended up being a bit exclusive, but the end result was that we were able to establish trust and then very gradually build out this coalition to have more and more women from different political parties, from the opposition, from inside Syria, from outside Syria, also with the different ethnic groups and religious groups. And they have now, although, again, I'm not trying to make this example any rosier than obviously we know the situation would warrant, but they have been able to coalesce around a few advocacy points, like, for example, representation in the Constitutional Committee. So they've been able to find common denominators that they can all agree on, although they would be very diametrically opposed on a lot of issues. And interestingly, compared to what I said earlier, one of the main issues that they're having trouble finding common ground on is precisely justice and how to deal with, accountability for the atrocities that have been committed. So I'm going to conclude also by making another pitch, which is that next month UN Women is organizing with several partners a global convening that we do every few years on women's meaningful participation. And this year the theme is constituency building. So I'll share information today with the organizers and would welcome the colleagues here to participate in the open sessions, which are going to be on the 7th and the 27th of July. And I think that's an opportunity to really delve deeper into this topic of how we find those common denominators and encourage and facilitate and provide space and time for women from very diverse groups to be able to come around a few common advocacy points that they can then take forward into the peace process. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Sarah. We do have a question from an audience member from Anne-Marie Getz. Hi, Anne-Marie. So I'll read it out, and then panelists, if you just want to raise your hand in whatever order you'd like to take this question, that would be great. So Anne-Marie asks, in retrospect, what could have been included in the post-conflict power sharing agreement that could have generated more effective security for women human rights defenders? Or are the key elements and institutional provisions in place but inadequately or not implemented? Elaine.
Okay, I'll be super brief. The one thing I will say is it's a bit of both. Some things are missing, some things are inadequately or not at all implemented. In terms of what's missing, and it was always a sort of a pie in the sky type of hope anyway, because we are not going to have 1325 recognised and implemented in Northern Ireland in terms of officially. There's a general sort of sense that we should at least try to implement the spirit of it, but that's not being done effectively. And some of the things that the Women's Coalition, who, as we mentioned in this, are often mentioned as having really flown the flag for women's participation in the process. Some of their most considerable wins or things that could have made a long-term difference, including things like the civic forum, have been completely dropped. They're not gone from the written document. They're just not implemented, and at any time that they're raised as a possibility for revival, they're generally dismissed as being too expensive and not worth the outlay, if you will, in terms of what they bring in. So I would say it's a bit of both from my point of view. I'll stop there.
Thanks so much, Elaine. Would any other panelists like to discuss that question before we move on?
Gretchen, I would say as well that, I mean, obviously with retrospect, you know, it'd be easy to say we should have brought in sort of more robust processes or quotas or things like that. But I mean, really, the language wasn't there at the time. But one thing that we were hearing, particularly in the interviews, was that even what you would think would be the most straightforward issues around rights and equality are interpreted through the lens of the political conflict. So everything is seen as belonging to one side or to the other, and everything becomes interpreted in that regard. You know, so if one party brings in quotas and gender equality, it's seen as something that's being used to undermine the politics of the other side. You know, and so at that level, it's difficult to know what legal response would make any difference to that, because it is there on paper a commitment that we will have equality, and then Section 75 is used to justify a very narrow version of equality that excludes gender. Now, the inclusion of gender and women or misogyny in Section 75 of the Northern Ireland Act would potentially make a difference in relation to how policymakers have to think about the equality impact on women specifically in Northern Ireland. So that would be one thing. But even the discussion on the human rights, the Bill of Rights, for example, is even if it's not overtly political, the way in which parties engage or don't engage constructively in the processes that would lead to the passing of equality law or policies is done on a sectarian basis, and that is embedded into the structure of the agreement, the consociational power sharing. And one of the journalists in Belfast, Amanda Ferguson, has been writing recently and highlighting how these mechanisms that are designed to ensure cross-community stability or consent are being used to block rights-based developments as well, in ways that, you know, weren't really intended in the agreement.
Yeah, and if I could come in and add, Gretchen, just on the back of what Elaine and Catherine have said, thanks for the question, Anne-Marie. Hi. It's a great question. I think one of the things that struck us, and Catherine and I talked about this a lot as we were listening to women share their experiences with us, was really striking to me around the Ddr model, as it's called, if you like, at global levels, and certainly from what I've seen in different countries, and in terms of the modeling, is this piece around integration of combatants, right? The reintegration piece, because it struck me when you look at the landscape of Northern Ireland right now, is that the Ddr models are very much focused on individual combatants and demobilising them. This piece around women who are combatants, women who are associated with in various roles, and the focus on these individuals. But actually, if you look in Northern Ireland, the consequences of strategies like empowering the men through, you know, take away the guns, give them jobs, give them roles at community levels, and funding their community development work, so-called, has, as we talked about earlier, displaced the very grassroots organic work that women have been doing on peace building across community lines. And what that has actually done is ignored the piece around how reintegration is not just focused on the individual, it's the reception of these men back into communities, and what that means in terms of the strategies that we use to, you know, take away the violence, if you like, and lay down the guns, but that actually legitimizes their power at community level. And now they act as gatekeepers for their communities. So you're actually empowering these men to have more power as a consequence of the peace agreement. And as Catherine talked about, the sectarianization really of all of these strategies. So I think a real piece here coming out of the peace agreement is thinking back to how do we think about reintegration. It's not just the individuals, it's about the dynamic that creates in society and how that displaces power in different ways and reinforces power of some over others as an informal outcome, if you like, of the peace agreement.
Thank you so much, everyone. Just so much fascinating information in this report and this panel of experts. I appreciate this so much. So I'd love to turn to a question on, we haven't touched quite as much maybe as I'd like on the question of securitization of these these approaches to these concerns. So I wonder if, to me, this perhaps is a question for Elaine and the report authors, but again, anyone is welcome to answer. What are some of the alternatives, concrete alternatives to the securitized approach to participation-related protection concerns in Northern Ireland or elsewhere, any context?
So I would say you have to switch the entire problem upside down. And instead of looking at what's happening to these individual women, which of course it's of paramount importance to those women in that moment, but where's it coming from? And what can we do to disrupt that flow that keeps creating more and more people who will carry out these threats or make these threats? And first of all, we do need to have a serious conversation as a society about the misogyny and sexism that we allow to fester here, particularly because everything is clouded over with the most important primary issue at all times is the green and orange, if you will, the two sides that comes first above everything, which means that everything else, every other complaint is seen as frivolous and unimportant. So I think starting with a really serious approach to talking about gendered issues as issues that cross that divide, as issues that apply to all women, regardless of their political opinion, their background, and so on, and then starting to make policy in a way that is sensitive to those gender differences. It will come, I'm not really in general in life a big believer in things coming from the top down. I think often things work better from the bottom up, but in this case, because the top is so rigid, it does need to make moves first, really, before that starts to be felt beyond that. So I think taking on gender sensitive policy making across the board, even when the issue doesn't immediately present itself as being something that needs to be done in a gender sensitive way, it has outworkings that almost always impact more on women than on men. Examples include things like austerity and so on. I mean, right now on bus shelters down the road from me, you will see a poster that says illegal money lenders, that's paramilitaries, manipulate you or words to that effect. I think it's manipulate, control you, something like that. Everybody knows this. This is the issue. Everybody knows that that's the case. But poverty and embedded austerity, which particularly impacts women, is forcing them into a situation where they know they're being manipulated and controlled by these people, but there is nowhere else they can go to put electricity on their meter, to feed their children, wherever it happens to be. So making pronouncements without looking at how the policy is influencing the actual women on the ground is not going to help. So I think start from that, and then in addition to that, start reorganizing how the funding is works. And like I mentioned earlier, it needs to go towards the stuff that's actually useful, that's making a tangible difference, rather than whatever it ticks the right boxes on a policymaker's sheet of priorities. Like I said, the adoption of 1325, but I think when it comes to paramilitary or deparamilitarization work as in a sort of interlocutor, it can't be put onto women as the least offensive. So all of those things could be changed relatively easily. Those are policy matters. And then when it comes to on the ground, the effects would start to be felt. Also, some of the things in the report, and I don't want to step on either Catherine or Ashling's toes, that I thought were particularly useful were around how social media threats and abuse could be handled better by the social media companies and so on. And that's a policy that doesn't work. It doesn't happen on Northern Ireland level. It happens at Westminster. So I think there needs to be robust action on that too. I'll stop now.
Thank you so much, Elaine. Catherine, would you like to, saw you unmute yourself, would you like to speak to that too?
Yes, thank you. Well, not to exactly the same point, but the same issue around the individual versus the social and the individual in the social and how this works. It troubles me all the time. Like, I think about it quite regularly. Like, why is it possible to degrade or to undermine a woman by circulating a photoshopped picture of her in a bikini, for example? Why is it possible to destroy somebody very senior's professional credibility by suggesting or starting a rumor that she has had an affair? Where are these attitudes come from? And until these attitudes towards sexuality generally are challenged, then it's the individual is the victim within this system, whereby the failure to tackle the attitudes that certain things are shameful and obviously very gendered norms consider certain things to be shameful, makes it possible to undermine women particularly, but also, I mean, there are a number of male politicians who have their professional lives I don't know, overshadowed by rumours about their sexuality as well. And so until these types of social attitudes within which politics happens are challenged, I think that the systemic aspect of it is still going to be there, and it's still going to be, no matter what individual women are able to put up with, or no matter how individual women are able to challenge this, that context will still be there for all women, and you know, not everybody will be willing or able to stand up to it to enter public life.
Thank you so much, Catherine. Ashlyn, please go ahead.
Thanks, Gretchen. Yeah, just to come in, and I suppose what's been great is Elaine has really talked about the micro, and Catherine has kind of talked about the systems level of, and I'm going to lift us out again maybe and talk now about the global level. And one of the things that struck us, and Catherine and I spent a lot of time debating this and talking about it as we were hearing, you know, the interviews were coming in and we were reflecting on them, was this idea that, okay, so we have at the moment some attention to the relationship between participation and protection emerging in the WPS resolutions. Sarah Taylor has talked about it a bit, and Caoimhe from the Irish Mission has raised how this is coming up more and more across different countries, and it is a, you know, a global concern, as we know. But as we become more focused on this relationship and we become, I suppose, have a deeper understanding of the protection risks to women in participation roles, there was a moment where we thought, is there a risk here where we take only or solely a securitized approach to women's protection? And I think this is really important for us to catch this now, because we've seen over the trajectory of the last 20 years that there was a moment when we were really giving a lot of attention to the issue of sexualized violence, that it became quite securitized. And that was for different reasons, and it emerged and it got states on board, and it was a very important moment, but also meant that the issue of sexualized violence went down a very particular track. We lost sight of gender inequalities at one point, you know, we're kind of coming around to that again. And I think the same risk presents itself here with the protection idea. I think for me, I think about the idea that, okay, so if we call for more protection around women's participation, will that invoke paternalist attitudes where the men will step in and try and protect the women from other men? Is that going to happen? How can we make sure that the tensions between participation and protection don't ingrain and enforce the sexism and misogyny that Elaine and Catherine have just described? So there's a real moment here where absolutely 100% we need to acknowledge there is a security element. We need to make sure women are safe. 100% there, as Sarah has said, these are real threats. We have to take them seriously. For example, in Northern Ireland, though, we heard from a number of women who, you know, the solution to the threats that they were experiencing were, we have to move house. So are you telling women that, okay, you've received a threat from this group, so you have to move your house, your family, your children from their school? And in a context like Northern Ireland, actually finding somewhere new to live is not that easy, because society there is a fallout of segregation from the conflict. Finding somewhere that you're comfortable and safe, etc., is more than challenging. So, you know, is our solution to remove women, and that's the solution? Or is it actually a much deeper look at what protection is, and where, as Catherine has said, attitudes, norms, beliefs, practices around misogyny and sexism, and really getting at the heart of that? So you need a dualistic approach, not one or the other, and that we mustn't forget that actually the root causes of this, and the idea, you know, the fact is that women who are taking on these roles are confronting gender stereotypes, and they're challenging those, and they're challenging sectarianism, and that combination confronts the power that comes out of the peace agreement. So if that's the case, what are we doing to tackle both gender and sectarianism, as well as the security needs of women? And, you know, we just need a much deeper consideration now, before we dive deep into this, if that's where we're going, of what, you know, protection related to participation might
Thank you so much, Ashlyn. So I'm conscious of time. We have about 10 minutes left. So what I'm going to do is, we have a couple more questions that I'm just going to read out. And then panelists, I'd like to invite you all to address whichever of those questions you feel comfortable, and maybe weave your closing remarks in about 2 minutes. I know it's quite quick, but I'll read these quickly. So we have an audience question. I'm not actually sure if this quite speaks to the expertise of our panelists, but I'll read it off. So what happens to women whose husbands are jailed for being ISIS members in Northern Ireland? Citing a 2018 NPR article. Does anyone know whether women are still targeted for receiving $50 a month for childcare from jailed relatives and getting the death penalty for that? And is there a study that's been done to discuss these types of sentences? And to me, this does go back to some of Elaine's comments from a few minutes ago. Additionally, as many of these interviews illustrate in the research, the Northern Irish context is especially unique. Small communities and overall low numbers of women in political processes means hypervisibility. What are other contexts, whether countries or regions, to which the findings of this research could or should be applied? And finally, and we've touched on this a bit, but this research describes an emerging women human rights defenders and peace builder dyad, citing that within the UN in particular, those are really sort of the two main categories within which, of course, many women do not actually identify themselves or sort of fit in their work. So I'd love to hear, what are some of the limitations of the terms being used at the UN within international systems generally, and how might those be expanded? So kind of not small questions, but please feel free. Catherine, if you're comfortable, or actually Sarah's got her hand up, so we'll pass to Sarah, and then if folks want to think through that, that'd be great. Go ahead, Sarah. Douglas.
Sure, I just wanted to briefly respond to the question about ISIS, because UN Women is working on that in coordination with entities like the UN Office of Counterterrorism and UNICEF, who are responsible for the repatriation of children associated with ISIS. And just to comment that it's obviously a very complicated issue, but what we've been doing as UN Women, also in partnership with OHCHR, is to ensure that whatever member states do is done in compliance with standards of human rights and due diligence. Particularly with the women, we know that they are not simply victims or perpetrators. It's usually a combination of all of the above, and very complicated scenarios that led them to Syria and Iraq, and also many of them have children. Some of them were minors when they went there. They became mothers even as minors, and then now they're over 18, and it's a very complicated situation that all the member states who are involved are dealing with. But what we are trying to promote is that regardless of the individual situation, you need gender-sensitive screening to really understand, are these women, have they been traumatized? What have they done? What has been done to them, etc. And then whatever actions are taken by member states need to comply with our established standards of human rights and due diligence. If they are guilty of crimes, put them on trial and let them face justice. But what is happening is a lot of them find themselves in limbo, where they're not being charged, they're not being allowed to return, and this is not acceptable from a human rights point of view. So that's the message that we're trying to send as UN Women. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sarah. Catherine, may I turn to you next for closing remarks?
Yeah, just very briefly on the point about the dyad. That is something that has really sort of occupied my thinking for a while now about this. It feels like almost that we expect women to be exceptional, that we need to put this label of peace builder on them, or we, expect them really to distinguish themselves to then be worthy of participation and to be worthy of the protection that comes with that. And they're doing the research for this and talking through this with Ashlyn around the individual versus the structural really helped my understanding of why I was a bit uncomfortable with this, is that if we create a system whereby we expect women to be exceptional, and then we have to have these exceptional responses to the risks that they face, then we're, I think, not paying enough attention to what do we need to do to enable all women to fulfill whatever their ambition would be to contribute. And whatever that is, it doesn't have to be that everybody wants to participate in high-level talks or that everybody wants to be a public figure, but what do we do to make it safe for women to have opinions, basically, is, I think, that's where the thinking around the dyad comes in for me. Yes, we celebrate those who are exceptional in doing this work, but how do we make all women safe to be in public? Yeah.
Thank you, Catherine. I'll be thinking about what do we do to make it safe for women to have opinions for a long time. It's very powerful. So I wonder, Ashlyn, can I pass to you for your closing? Thank you.
Sure. Thanks, Gretchen. Yeah, I'll be thinking about that too, for sure. And this research has made us, Catherine and I, lay awake at night and think about these things for way too long than we should have probably. But, you know, it was just remarkable listening to women share these experiences, and the shock factor is there. And I think we should be shocked, actually. We should be shocked that in 2021, it's not okay to just express your opinion. You'll get a comeback from that. I want to just touch on the question that you raised around applicability of the research to other contexts. And you know, we kept thinking about this as we were developing it and compiling kind of the main findings and themes, if you like. And for sure, and Sarah Taylor has alluded to this, and we're all aware who work in the WPS space, that these kinds of issues will come up across the globe in many different conflict contexts. And I think a couple of things jump out at us to think about. The first is that, okay, so if we're seeing this in somewhere like Northern Ireland, 20 years post-agreement, what's happening in somewhere that's still quite live, if you like, in terms of the armed conflict that's coming out, and that we really need to be paying attention to this from the get-go. And okay, so we have some evidence that these protection issues arise for women who may have an opinion who participate. And I think what's relevant then is for us to do research that's context specific to those contexts, to figure out if there are potential for not just sexism and harassment, as there will be in every context, but the kinds of risks and threats that arise out of armed violence, peace agreements, and how they're inculcated, that we really need to be doing work to understand what that looks like specific to this context, and to hear from women who are affected themselves, and for those women to voice those concerns, and to have a context specific approach, if you like, to each conflict setting, if you like, and to do that work. And also, you know, there's the research piece, is the context specific piece, but then there's also a lesson here for peace agreements, you know, and Anne-Marie's question alluded to that, and we've kind of talked about it, is that with new peace agreements coming along, what are the things that we need to think about around how peace is structured and negotiated, what's in there, what actually does, as Elaine said, get implemented or get forgotten about because it's inconvenient and not deemed as important. How does it become important as part of the peace agreement? And this piece around so-called DDR, right, that how do you take away power by not reinstating further layers of power to men in these communities, that demobilizes and works to deconstruct women's voices and their ability to speak. So there's a real piece here to get these ideas into the peace agreements as the founding document for the dispensation of peace, if you like, from the get-go, and for that to be taken seriously. And of course, that's our wish for peace agreements around the world, and it is a long-held wish, I think. But there's a piece here around understanding each context itself, and now the lesson is get it into a peace agreement from the get-go as really important. I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ashlyn. I do want to flag that we have a last-minute audience question asking how we can compare this context to the struggles of the Palestinian people. A very big question. So Sarah and Elaine, I know you're the last two to give comments, so please no pressure, but I did want to flag that. So I'll pass briefly to Sarah Taylor. I know we're at 10:30, but do please stick with us for another 2 minutes, and Sarah, and we'll close out with Elaine. Thank you.
Well, Rima, I do not thank you for an absolutely impossible question for me to answer or address in any way in the last 2 minutes. So I'm not sure that I'm going to be able to address that, except by saying in this sort of broader context, again, to what contexts, this question around where is this applicable, how can we say that it's not applicable everywhere? I mean, when we look at the fact that this is around, you know, the context specificity of Northern Ireland as a small community where people are very visible, and women in particular are very visible, women are very visible in political leadership globally because they are so underrepresented. It does not matter if we are talking about countries with tens, hundreds of millions of people, or with a few million people. Women are underrepresented and therefore are more visible, right? Because of this rarity. When women in political leadership also face gender-specific threats universally, right? So this is not springing out of nowhere. This is exactly the point that the authors have been making and that we've been discussing here, is that underlying and underpinning this are these patriarchal, hierarchical structures that embed misogyny and make it dangerous for women to have opinions. Thank you, Catherine, for that. You know, this is a global challenge. So I just wanted to flag that this is, you know, I mentioned Afghanistan, I mentioned the UN Security Council. Certainly, Palestinian women as well, grappling not only with conflict that is affecting their countries, but also the misogyny from their own party members. This was certainly an issue that came up in my research when I was doing research on women negotiators in Guatemala in the early 1990s in terms of political leadership. So I just want to close on this issue around dyads. One of the issues around dyads is, I think that the point that Catherine raised here is about is in part of an outcome of the advocacy around making the case for women to have a role. Often as advocates, we are asked, what is it that women do differently? And this is where it's really important to point to the specificities of the research that shows that inclusive processes are more durable. This does not mean parachuting women in to participate. This means a process that is designed as inclusive, holistically, right? That takes the pressure off of women only being able to be one thing and address one kind of issue and take on one kind of role, which is either as you say, the peace builder, that dyad. So I think that the more constantly contextualizing that as women have an actual right to participate, and what that means and how that allows for this diversity is one of the things that we need to be talking about in our efforts going forward. Again, I just want to say thank you. I'm going to stop now. Thank you so much. This has been such a great and scintillating conversation. So,
thank you, Sarah. And finally, last but very much not least, I'd like to pass it to Elaine to close us out.
Okay, so I'll try to be very brief, but I saw that question come up in the chat about Palestinian women and the situation there, and it almost made me smile a little inside, not because I'm not, filled with sympathy for everything there, but that is another example of a thing that has been sectarianized in Northern Ireland. So there is already, I don't know whether people outside of here are aware of that, there are already divisions on the issue of Palestine and Israel and support for which side. In some communities you will see Palestinian flags flying prominently as people identify closely with the Palestinian people. In other communities you'll see the Israeli flag fly, whether it's identifying with the Israeli people or whether it's because there's Palestinian flags on the other road is sometimes a difficult one to say. It could be a toss-up either way. It's another example of an issue that speaking about it here is very difficult to do without speaking about it in a sectarian context. And I think that's what I wanted to say at the end, really. This has been an excellent and outstanding, sort of joyful forum for talking about an incredibly difficult and painful subject, because speaking about those things here is like handling a hot potato. It is, well, uncomfortable at best, and it can have ramifications long after the conversation has ended, as we've discussed throughout this. So it has been an excellent opportunity to talk about these things away from a Northern Ireland context. And I'm sure it's equally true of many, many conflicts around the world, where it's sometimes easier to speak to people who aren't embedded here than it is to speak about it here, because it's oftentimes like ripping a wound open again, simply even talking about those things. So behind all of this is a need to do something serious about the wounds here that have never healed.
Thank you so much, Elaine. And I do, just quickly before we close out, want to ask Rachel Powell if she would like to give any closing remarks. No pressure at all. I know I'm putting you on the spot, but if you'd like to say something, please.
Thank you, Gretchen. I just think on behalf of the Women's Resource and Development Agency, I would just really like to echo what has been said today, but to thank IPI and the researchers involved. Women's lived experience is at the very core of our work. And I think it is crucial that we look at women, peace and security and how women are being directly impacted by that through the lens of women's lived experience, whether that is in public or political life. We have a very long way to go in Northern Ireland. Gender equality has never been a priority in the peace process. And I am hopeful, from conversations like this today, that we can continue making some progress and challenge the harmful policy making and attitudes that are so prevalent in Northern Ireland still. So thank you so much, and very much on the spot there.
That was wonderful. Thank you, Rachel. Thank you to all of our panelists. Thank you to Catherine and Ashlyn for an absolutely incredible paper. I want to just one more time plug for everyone watching. It is such an excellent read, and I know Cleva said this earlier, but it actually, I swear it really is a page turner of a policy paper, which is unbelievable. I actually don't know how you did that, but it's so good. So I really recommend that everyone look at the report. Thank you, everyone. It's been wonderful. This has been a great way to start my day. And I hope that we can all gather again sometime.